Hey guys, this is Race of History. I'm Race. I'm back today to do Oversimplified World War II Part 1. This is going to be my second Oversimplified series, I guess. I've done two videos, the Part 1 and Part 2 to World War I, and now I'm going to start on their World War II video. So here we go.
This video was made possible by Skillshare. Churchill was a man with many talents. He was an artist, a butterfly enthusiast, and he had an unpublished manuscript about aliens. Clearly, he was a man with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Maybe he could have loaded up his computer and logged onto Skillshare, an online learning community with more than 19,000 classes in design, business, technology, and more. Perhaps he was considering a side career in fashion, but didn't know where to start. On Skillshare, he would find courses in fashion design and garment construction. Or if he wanted to learn app design, and I was genuinely blown away by this link, which can be found in the description, will get their first. It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war, but his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold.
Okay, so yeah, Mussolini essentially starts a takeover of Italy. It's kind of a long process. He leaves to not serve in the military. He comes back and ends up serving in the military. At the time, he had a socialist newspaper that had gotten, some traction. So he was like a person of notoriety serving in the war. And whenever he gets back and he starts to, try to congregate a movement around these sort of ideals that he has, he kind of has to bring under the wing or the fold all of these separate military groups that had sprung up after the war had ended. Kind of like the Soviets that started popping up in Russia post-World War I. You have all of these Soviets that have workers and soldiers and all that sort of stuff. That same sort of thing is happening in Italy with soldiers. And Mussolini kind of gradually starts to bring them under his control. And he outmaneuvers towards the end some other big Italian leaders who were leading some of these other movements. And, he kind of gets them out of the way and is able to take over the big movement as a whole. And then he basically marches and takes over Italy.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?" "This army."
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Oh,
War Thunder, the military online action game, has received this year's first major update. The branch of...
all right.
Fair enough. Then he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all this felt to Germans.
Yeah, so the Treaty of Versailles is, in my opinion, the precursor to World War II. The language in the Treaty of Versailles, in my opinion, directly leads to what will be the start of World War II, especially Germany having to take fault for the entire war. Looking back on that historically, that seems like literally one of the dumbest moves ever. And it really doesn't make much sense. Like I talked about this in the World War I video. There are historians today that argue that Russia wanted this war, and that's why they had soldiers that were already ready to go on or very near the Eastern Front whenever World War I broke out. They were on, I guess it's on their Western Front, but on Germany's East, Russia had soldiers that didn't have to mobilize with the rest of the huge army. They were already there in the area, ready to fight almost immediately when the war started. There are a bunch of different reasons for the start of World War I. A lot of them tragic and brutally, miscommunications and stuff like that. But in the Treaty of Versailles, they basically just did everything they could to stomp Germany's nose in the fact that they lost. And it's basically what Hitler runs on to become the head of the Nazi Party and for the Nazi Party to take the lead in German politics. He's hammering constantly the Treaty of Versailles and how much like nonsense it was, and all of the things that it did that basically shunned Germany from the rest of the West or continental Europe. And it's literally the thing that I believe leads directly to World War II. I think it was terrible, terrible diplomacy and politics by Britain and France. And I guess the U.S. didn't really want the terms to be so harsh, but even with them, being a part of, it was just a bad diplomacy all around.
On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attended a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of...
That's the biggest thing for Japan. World War I is they're basically expanding, taking German territories in the area because they know that Germany's at war in Europe and can't do anything about it. And World War II, if you look at what Japan is doing tactically, they're hunting for natural resources. Almost everything that they do is based on natural resources, except northern China. Northern China was something that they felt really good about whenever they started the invasion process. But actually, it ended up that they were having to, they were hoping to get food for mainland Japan from China. They were actually having to import food to northern China after they conquered it just to feed the people there. So that was a total backfire. But almost everything else they did um, was specifically for those natural resources because, yeah, like it mentions, they don't have any. And you have to have them at this point to prosecute a major war.
kind of stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia. And then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty, the first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good portion...
Yeah, Lebensraum, I mean, it means literally living space. In order to, like he said, increase the Aryan population, the thought process was, okay, well, if we increase this population and do it through things like eugenics, then where are we going to put all these new Aryans? And so that's where the idea of Lebensraum comes from. And that's that Lebensraum and the, I guess, difference in ideology is the main factors in what will eventually become the invasion of Russia. Um, Russia's massive, so that checks the Lebensraum off the list. And the ideological differences between what Hitler believes and what he sees communism as it's a totally untenable situation, which is why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is historically, it was probably scary at the time for the Western powers. Historically, it's kind of hilarious because when you look back at it, you're like, there's no way that this was going to continue for any major amount of time. They literally hated what the other side believed. But I mean, it worked for a little bit until, Hitler decided to invade.
Of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, I want that thing, and the Allies would say, you can't have that thing. Okay, you can have that thing, but no more. I want that thing. And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans.
He is hoping at this point that a war breaks out at one of these. I mean, he's literally pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and the Allies are so fearful of another major war. France is still essentially hosting an army that, for all intents and purposes, parallels what their World War I army was. And the British and the U.S. and any other major power just has no appetite for what it would take to prosecute a major war at this point. And so, yeah, Hitler's just pushing and pushing and pushing. And each time he's just given what he wants in the hopes that it'll be the last one and it'll maintain peace. And then obviously that doesn't work. And the appeasement politicians of that time period, kind of get dunked on a lot by modern historians. But you can sort of understand they just came out of World War One. They're deathly afraid of the casualties and the manpower and the natural resources and the economic toll it will take to prosecute another major war. And so they just don't want to do it for any reason.
The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, look, we're going to give you what... Hang on. This meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too?
No.
Anyway, we're going to give you what you want. Really? Yeah. Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay. Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace, and we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania. Then, in another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany...
The rape of Nanking is brutal. It is. If you have not done any research on it or heard much about it, there are plenty of stories and books and texts from different historians and contemporaries at the time that go into exactly how brutal it was. So brutal that when word gets back to the West and starts to trickle that direction, the West doesn't believe it. They think it can't possibly be that bad. Just give it a look if you haven't.
Germany and Italy made their relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future. Sounds good.
Jesus, another one.
This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much. The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel.
That's a misnomer. They didn't put the exact same defensive structures all the way to the border, but I hear this all the time that the Maginot Line stops where Belgium is. That's not true. There are still structures there today that are on the Franco-Belgian border that are defensive in nature and from this time period. I'm not entirely sure where that idea comes from. Maybe it's because there was so much arguing. You can understand why the Belgians don't want that defensive wall there. They're basically like, we're trapped on this side of the locked door. So if you're going to put a big defensive wall in, maybe do it in front of us where we're behind the locked door and not where we're out in front of the locked door and you can just lock it and, go inside. So.
And they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your armfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans. Hitler's overall strategy.
Yeah, Churchill was seen as a radical before this point. He had the failed Gallipoli, experience in World War I, and he had been talking about war with Hitler and the Germans long before this point. And so, much like Teddy Roosevelt was seen in the U.S. in World War I, where he was continuously advocating for entering the war way before the U.S. got involved in the war, that's how Churchill is seen before he gets in as prime minister. You have this major push to try to stay out of another, big European war. And Churchill the whole time is saying it's not going to work. It's not going to work. We have to go to war. And everybody said, nope, he's a radical. If it was up to him, we'd already be at war. And it wasn't until really push came to shove and everybody saw the writing on the wall that they went to that quote unquote radical and said, all right, we'll listen to you now. And he gets in as prime minister.
Strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the Phony War, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best armies and nearly wiping out the British too. But they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to...
They almost did. There was a big push politically in Britain at this point to, make terms, to sue for peace. And you can see why. When their troops are trapped at Dunkirk, it looks like all of their professional army is about to get wiped out in France. And there's nothing left to stop an invasion of the homeland. And so there's a major push in the UK at this time to sue for peace. And I think, this is just my opinion, but I think had Churchill not been the one that was sitting in the prime minister's seat, that might have actually happened. there might have been a sue for peace from Britain with Germany, and then that war is over at that point. The war on the West is over. Britain's out. France is a puppet state. Belgium's down. They have basically everything except for half of Poland that Russia has and Russia, and they can turn almost their full might against that, against the Russian front. It was very close. It's argued now that Hitler could not have won the war no matter what he did. I don't subscribe to that. I think there were, just like everything historically, there's things that happen in the moment. Some are small, some are big, but they drastically impact what the future of a continent or a conflict looks like. And I think the same for this one.
To secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships.
Yeah.
So have at it. Hitler then began laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there.
Yep.
Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Golly, this was a good one. I'll do part 2 probably at some point this evening, but yeah, that was such a good video. Oversimplified does such a good job with these. All right, well, this is Race of History. I am Race. Like, share, subscribe, help me grow a channel here. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.